Hey guys, in the previous section, the idea of a variable having a nil value was very briefly brought up, but wasn't explained in great depth. So that's why in this section, we're going to be exploring the concept of optional variables, which are essentially variables that may or may not have a nil value at some point in time. So our specific focus is first going to be on what is a nil value, what does it represent, and what are some of the problems that nil values can cause within our code. Once we can understand this, we'll move on to how to fix the problem through the use of optional variables and unwrapping these optional variables to see whether or not the value is nil. We'll go a little bit more into this topic once we start talking about control flow as well, which will allow us to check to see if a variable has a nil value and then perform some basic error checking and problem solving to make sure that kind of problem doesn't crash our code. So for those of you who have programmed in other languages like Java, you'll often see this idea of a variable having a null value. Well, it's exactly the same as an object or a variable having a nil value within Swift, which essentially means at that point in time, that variable's value literally does not exist. So that's what a nil or null value means. It's simply that that particular variable has no value at that point in time. Now this is different from, say, a number having a value of 0 or a string being empty, because even though those values might not be significant, they do exist, which means a variable that has, or that is an empty string, or a variable that has a value of 0, they both do have some kind of a value. Now this means if we try to access that value, maybe we won't be able to do so much with it, but if we try to access the value, it's not going to cause our program or application to crash. Now this is very different from a variable having a nil or a null value, which again essentially means that value doesn't exist and will cause the program or application to crash if we try to access that particular variable's value when it's nil. And this is because we're really trying to access something that literally doesn't exist. Now, if we know this is going to be a problem and can cause an app or program to crash, why on earth would we even implement the idea of a variable having a nil or a null value? Well, the idea stands that there will be some points in time at which a variable should have no value associated with it. For example, let's say we were trying to take text from some kind of an input, maybe like a text box or something, and there is no text in that particular text box. Well, in that case, we might want to say that that particular text box's text is nil because it literally doesn't exist. There's no text within that box whatsoever. So it's just kind of a way of saying that a variable may have a value at some point in time, just right now it doesn't because it's appropriate for that variable to not have a value. So let's say, for example, we were again developing some kind of a game. We have a character who may or may not be holding something at some point in time. So this isn't the best way to represent this particular type of variable, but let's say we have some variable called item in right hand. Okay, and this is just going to be a string type variable. Again, would be better represented with like an enumeration or something, but more on that later. So it's just going to be item in right hand, we'll set it to a string, and it's just going to be, I don't know, an axe. Maybe our character is chopping down some wood or something. Well, what if at some point our character drops the axe and so has nothing in his or her right hand? Well, rather than saying item in right hand equals something like nothing, okay, which isn't necessarily appropriate because then we can still associate some value with this. We want this variable to essentially have no value because we want nothing to be there. Well, for that, we're going to change our string type to what's called an optional string type, and we declare it as optional with the question mark here. So this means that at some point in time, item in right hand may or may not take on the value of nil. That doesn't mean that it will happen spontaneously. It will only take on a nil value if we assign it to be nil. But what this means is then we can say item in right hand equals nil, and this isn't going to throw us errors. If we try to if we try to set a definite string to a nil value, we're going to get an error saying that strings cannot take on a non-nil value. And this goes for any type of variable. So if it's not declared as optional with the question mark, then it can never take on the value of nil. Okay, so this goes for any other types, integers, booleans, all of them can have nil values at some point if we declare them as optional with this question mark here. So once something is declared nil, assuming it's optional of course, then we can actually change its value back to something else. So now let's say item in right hand equals something like, I don't know, a pickaxe. Okay, and that's perfectly fine to do. We can change it from nil to pickaxe. Nil you can think of as just being a temporary, well, possibly temporary placeholder that says, okay, we have no value associated with this variable. Now, once again, the problem comes in when we try to access a variable's value and we find that it is nil. So if we try to access the variable's value now, it would just evaluate to pickaxe. Of the very first, at the start, it would have just been axe. But if we tried to access it halfway through, it would have been nil and would probably have caused our program to crash. So there's a couple of ways around this issue. The first is to check to see if a variable has a value, and if it doesn't, we simply store nil. And if the variable, the second way is to what's called force unwrap the variable, which says we don't care whether or not it has a value, we're just going to go ahead and assume it does. So let's cover the first way, and then we can take a look at force unwrapping later. So let's say I wanted the length of my string that's called item in right hand. Well, I'm just going to comment this out for now, and actually I'll comment this one out too. So we'll just move these on down a little bit. So in this case, I want to store my result in something called count. In fact, I'm going to create this to be a variable. It's called count, and we'll just say item in right hand. Actually, maybe length would be better. Item in right hand dot, okay, and we want dot count. So this will return a count of the number of characters, which should just be 3 for now. And notice how this question mark has been added automatically. So I could get rid of this question mark here, and this is going to show us a warning. And the warning is saying that item in right hand is optional, so it means that it could take on the value of nil, and if we do this without using the question mark, and item in right hand is nil, then this is going to cause our app to crash. So right now, this would still be okay. I mean, we're not going to be able to actually run the code like this, because the compiler is trying to make sure we don't make an error. But if we could, then it would be fine. I mean, we would get the count of 3, no problem. However, if we took this, paste it up here, then in this case we would definitely get an error and our app would definitely crash. And that's because we can't retrieve the count of something that doesn't exist. I mean, how can you retrieve a length of something that simply isn't there? So for that, we use our question mark. Oops, that's slash. This is a question mark. And basically what this says is we're going to try to retrieve the item in right hand dot count. And if item in right hand is nil, then we're just going to store the value of nil, and as you can see, that's exactly what's happened here. So length has now taken on the value of nil. If we were to comment this guy out, so we haven't assigned it to nil, then the length just equals 3, because we're saying, okay, we're going to try and retrieve this. That's right, it's not nil, so we can definitely get that, and we can retrieve the count and store it. So this is the best and safest way around the issue, because even if our item in right hand is nil, we're just going to store a nil value in this variable called length. We would then have to be careful to make sure that length is not nil if we were to then use this variable though. Okay, so as of now, length has taken on the value of optional int, like this, okay? And that is because, once again, if this is nil, then length is nil. If we try to force this to take on the value of a non-optional int, we get this error down at the bottom saying this should be optional, or we'll have to force unwrap this. So that's going to be our next concept, is the idea of force unwrapping a variable. So essentially what force unwrapping does, and it's slightly different from this, is saying we don't care whether or not our variable is nil, we're going to take the risk and we're just going to go ahead and assume that it's never going to be nil. So this practice of force unwrapping variables is definitely discouraged because, again, if you force unwrap something that doesn't exist, it's going to cause your app to crash. But it is going to be useful sometimes. There will be times when it's very appropriate to use, so I'll show you how to do it anyway. As well, we store the results in a slightly different variable type. So let's say we have variable length 2. Okay, this time we want this to be of type int. We want it to be a non-optional integer. Okay. Well, now what we can do is set this equal to item in right hand dot count, and we can force unwrap this using the exclamation mark here. Okay, actually what we'll need to do is put this in brackets as we're talking about this as a whole, and I'll explain in a second why that's different from what we did at first. But basically what this is doing is it's saying, okay, we are going to assume that item in right hand is never going to be nil, so that item in right hand dot count is never going to be nil, and we can just store its value within length 2. However, if this does work out to be nil, let's just cut this and paste it, then this would cause our program to crash. As you can see, there's a glaring error here. Okay, and that's why doing this is highly discouraged, because if you get into situations like this, again, you're going to get your program crashing prematurely. The benefit of doing this is that the results are stored within a non-optional type integer. Okay, so you might say, well, that's hardly a benefit at all, and that's not worth the risk, and I definitely agree, which is why this practice is discouraged. Now, the reason I had to add the brackets here is because it's this whole statement that might be optional. Okay, so it's not just if we'd just done this, then this would say, okay, count is going to be the optional part of this particular statement. But that's not the case, because it's this entire result of this statement here that would cause this to have a nil value. So this is called optional chaining. And if we were to retrieve other values from this, we would again have to use multiple question marks and then surround the entire thing in brackets. And I think it was using the word statement. This is actually an expression because it is returning a result. Okay, so once again, it's not count. It's not the count property that might be optional. It's the item in right hand that is optional. Okay, so that's why we cannot just set the exclamation mark to be after count, because count is non-optional. It's this guy that's optional, so the entire result would be optional. So once again, there are ways around this issue. There's actually certain operators that we can use, one especially called the nil coalescing operator. But I think I'll save that for the actual part where we cover the various operators that are available. And also we can use what are called if-let and guard-let statements to provide additional checking to make sure that we're only using variables if they do have a value. But we'll get more into those two statements once we start talking a bit more about control flow. For now, I just wanted to get you up to speed with the idea behind variables being optional. So again, we declare the optional type with a question mark, which means they could have the value of nil. It's better to use optional chaining and store the results in optional type variables as well, rather than force unwrapping everything and facing the risk of having your app or program crash. Alright, so that about concludes our intro to nil values. Again, we'll talk more about this topic a little later on. So in the next section coming up, we are going to be talking about how to store multiple values within a single variable without going too much into collections, which we'll save for the next major subject.